Blood on a tailored suit shouldn't smell like copper and expensive cologne. But it does. Nora knew working for Declan Gallagher meant ignoring the red stains. She just didn't expect him to corner her in an elevator plummeting 40 floors. He didn't pull a gun. He didn't threaten her. Instead, the most dangerous man in Chicago pinned her against the steel wall, raised a bruised, bloodied hand, and gently brushed a stray curl behind her ear. Spreadsheets usually offered a comforting symmetry. Nora stared at the glowing monitor, her finger hovering over the Enter key. Row 42, column C. $3 million allocated to waste management. She didn't ask questions. Asking questions at Gallagher Enterprises was a quick way to end up as part of the waste management program itself. She hit enter. The cell turned green. Outside her frosted glass window, the Chicago skyline was already swallowing to the sun, casting long, bruised shadows across the office floor. Everyone else had clocked out 2 hours ago. The smart ones left at 5 on the dot, keeping their heads down and their briefcases locked. Nora stayed because the quiet helped her breathe, and because the overtime pay kept her mother's assisted living facility from calling with final notices. It was a simple, cynical transaction. She traded her moral compass for decent dental insurance and a steady paycheck. Heavy, uneven footsteps echoed in the marble hallway. Nora froze, her hand dropping from the mouse. She knew the cadence of those steps. Usually they were sharp, predatory, measuring out the distance between him and whoever he was about to ruin. Tonight, they dragged. The glass doors to the executive suite swung open. Declan Gallagher walked in. He didn't look like the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar logistics firm. He looked like a man who had just crawled out of a car wreck. His charcoal jacket was missing. His white dress shirt, usually pressed to a crisp, blinding perfection, clung to his chest, torn at the shoulder, and smeared with a dark, rusted brown. Blood. A lot of it. Nora stood up slowly. Her chair scraped against the hardwood, sounding like a gunshot in the dead quiet of the floor. Declan stopped. He turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. His left cheekbone was swollen, a nasty cut bisecting his eyebrow. He breathed through his mouth, his chest rising and falling in sharp, jagged hitches. "You're still here," he said. His voice was a low rasp, stripped of its usual smooth, terrifying polish. "Quarterly reports," Nora replied, keeping her tone completely flat. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. If she screamed, if she ran, she became a liability. And Declan didn't keep liabilities on the payroll. "Do you need me to call someone, Mr. Gallagher?" "No." He swayed slightly, catching himself on the edge of her mahogany desk. His knuckles were split open, raw and bleeding onto the polished wood. "Pack up. You're going home." "I'm not finished with..." "Pack up, Nora." It wasn't a request. She grabbed her purse, shoved her laptop into its sleeve, and walked around the desk. She kept her distance, giving him a wide berth as they headed toward the private executive elevator. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. She could smell him now. It was an awful, metallic scent, mixed with the sharp bite of winter air and his signature bergamot cologne. It smelled like violence. She stared straight ahead at the brushed steel doors of the elevator, watching her own distorted reflection. Declan pressed the call button. He left a bloody fingerprint on the illuminated glass. The doors slid open. They stepped inside. The executive elevator was oversized, paneled in dark wood and mirrored glass, designed to make occupants feel important. Right now, it just felt like a very expensive cage. Declan hit the button for the parking garage. The doors hissed shut, cutting them off from the rest of the world. The descent began. 40 floors down. Usually, It took exactly 45 seconds. Nora counted them in her head. 1, 2, 3. At floor 32, Declan let out a low groan and leaned heavily against the handrail. His head rolled back against the mirror, leaving a smudge of dirt and sweat on the glass. He closed his eyes. In the harsh fluorescent light, he looked exhausted. For a fleeting second, the terrifying mob boss dissolved, leaving behind a battered, exhausted man who looked like he just wanted to sleep for a week. Nora looked away. Sympathy was dangerous. 15, 16, 17. At floor 26, the elevator violently shuddered. Nora gasped, stumbling forward as the floor dropped an inch, catching abruptly with a sickening shriek of grinding metal. The lights flickered, died, and then flared back to life, replaced by a dim, jaundiced emergency glow. Then, everything went perfectly still. The hum of the cables ceased. The ventilation fan sputtered and died. The sudden silence was absolute, pressing against Nora's eardrums until they ached. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tight. Declan opened his eyes. The exhaustion was gone, replaced instantly by a cold, calculating hyper-awareness. He pushed off the handrail, ignoring the grimace of pain that flashed across his face, and moved to the control panel. He slammed his palm against the emergency stop button, then hit the door open button. Nothing. He ripped open the panel for the emergency phone. He pulled the receiver to his ear. Nora watched his jaw tighten. The muscle feathered angrily under his bruised skin. He held the phone for 10 seconds, then slowly placed it back in its cradle. "Dead," he said. "The power grid?" Nora asked, pulling her cell phone from her pocket. She already knew the answer. No service. The elevator shaft was heavily shielded. They were in a concrete tube in the middle of a steel skyscraper. "Not the grid," Declan said softly. He stepped back from the panel, his eyes scanning the ceiling hatch. "The building has 3 backup generators. If the main power failed, the emergency line would still work. The line was cut." Nora's stomach plummeted faster than the elevator had. "Cut? By who?" Declan turned to look at her. The dim amber light caught the hard, merciless angles of his face. The man who had walked in exhausted was gone. The predator was back. "By whoever I was just dealing with," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "They followed me." The air in the cab was already growing stale. Without the ventilation fan, the heat of their bodies seemed to cling to the walls. Nora backed up slowly until her shoulder blades hit the cold mirror. "If they followed you, why trap us here? Why not just—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Shoot me in the lobby?" Declan offered, a grim, humorless smile pulling at the corner of his split lip. "Because the lobby has cameras. Because dropping a 50-ton elevator car is a tragic, mechanical failure. It's clean, no loose ends." He began pacing. It was a tight space, barely 6 feet across, but he moved with a restless, coiled energy. 3 steps forward, pivot, 3 steps back. The sharp scent of copper grew stronger with every movement he made. Nora watched the blood slowly dripping from his knuckles onto the plush carpet. Drip, drip. It was the only sound in the suffocating quiet. "So we wait for them to drop it," she stated. It wasn't a question. She was surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. Years of repressing her emotions in this job had apparently trained her for the moment of her own murder. Declan stopped pacing. He stared at her, really looked at her, his dark eyes narrowing. "You don't panic, do you, Nora? Would it help?" "No." He took a step toward her. Nora's breath caught. She pressed herself harder against the glass, instinctively trying to put distance between them. There was nowhere to go. He took another step. He was in her personal space now. He was tall, broad-shouldered, completely eclipsing the dim emergency light above them. The heat radiating off his body was intense, burning through the damp chill of his ruined shirt. "I won't let them drop the car," he said, his voice a low rumble that she felt in her chest more than she heard. "You don't control gravity, Declan." The first name slipped out before she could stop it. She always called him Mr. Gallagher. Always. He didn't correct her. Instead, he took the final step, closing the gap entirely. He didn't touch her, but he was so close she could feel the faint tremor in his muscles. He raised his right arm, planting his large, bloodied hand flat against the mirror right next to her head. He had caged her in. Nora looked up at him. She was trapped between the steel wall and a man who killed people for a living. Her heart began to pound, a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. She wondered if he could hear it. "I control everything in my building," Declan murmured, leaning in a fraction of an inch. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then slowly dragged back up to her eyes. "There are manual brakes on the external rails. They can sever the cables, but the brakes will hold. We just have to wait." "Wait for what?" she whispered. "For my people to realize I never made it to the garage. For them to come pry these doors open. And if the people who cut the lines get here first, then I kill them," he said simply. It wasn't a boast. It was a weather report. Fact. Inevitable. Nora swallowed hard. The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by a creeping, bone-deep terror. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sight of his bruised face, the smell of the blood, the sheer, suffocating weight of the situation. A slight tremor racked her shoulders. She clamped her teeth together, furious at her own weakness. She had held it together this long. She refused to break down in front of him. A heavy silence stretched between them. Then she felt it. He didn't grab her. He didn't use force. It was a gesture so completely at odds with the violence of his world that it shocked her eyes open. Declan lifted his left hand. His knuckles were ruined, the skin split and angry, but his fingers were incredibly gentle. He reached out and caught a loose curl of her dark hair that had fallen across her cheek. Nora froze, terrified to breathe. His knuckles lightly brushed against her jawline as he moved the hair. The contrast was jarring, the rough, raw ruin of his skin against the soft slope of her cheek. He slowly, deliberately tucked the curl behind her ear. His fingers lingered there for a second too long, the warmth of his thumb pressing a light, grounding pressure against the pulse point just below her jaw. He was feeling her heartbeat. "Breathe, Nora," he said quietly. The harshness had drained from his voice, leaving something almost tender in its wake. "You're safe." "I'm in a broken elevator with a bleeding mob boss," she managed to say, her voice shaking slightly. "Safe is a relative term." Declan let out a soft huff of breath that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. He didn't pull his hand away. He let his fingers slide down her neck, resting lightly on her shoulder. It was a possessive touch, a heavy anchor in the dark. "Relative," he agreed, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, burning intensity. "But true. Nothing happens to you tonight. Not while I'm breathing." The elevator gave another violent groan, the metal shifting ominously around them. The amber light flickered, casting deep, plunging shadows across Declan's face. He didn't flinch. He just kept his eyes on hers, his body shielding hers, waiting for the dark to fall. The metal around them settled with a final, shuddering groan, leaving the silence ringing in Nora's ears. The emergency light above flickered once, threatening to plunge them into total darkness before stabilizing into a weak, jaundiced glare. Declan didn't move his hand from her shoulder. The heat of him was a physical weight, grounding her against the rising panic that threatened to claw its way up her throat. He watched the ceiling for a long time, his jaw clenched, listening to the vast, empty echo of the shaft above them. When he finally looked back down at her, the adrenaline that had been holding him together seemed to crack. The fierce, terrifying light in his eyes dimmed. His hand slid off her shoulder, leaving a damp, heavy smear of crimson on her white silk blouse. "Sorry," he muttered, staring at the stain. It was the most ordinary word she had ever heard him speak, and it sounded entirely wrong coming from a man who casually authorized the destruction of rival syndicates between sips of espresso. Before Nora could respond, Declan's knees buckled. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was a slow, mechanical failure of a body that had simply run out of fuel. He slid down the mirrored glass of the elevator wall, leaving a wide, terrifying streak of blood against his reflection. He hit the carpeted floor with a heavy thud, his long legs sprawling out awkwardly in the confined space. Nora stared at him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes. His breathing was a harsh, wet sound. The corporate hierarchy dissolved in the space of 3 seconds. He wasn't Mr. Gallagher anymore. He was just a dying man in a box, and she was the only one left to balance the ledger. Nora dropped to her knees beside him. The plush, expensive wool of her skirt soaked up the dampness of the carpet. She didn't care. She reached into her purse and pulled out her cell phone. No signal, but the flashlight worked. She turned it on, casting a harsh, blinding beam over him. Declan flinched, raising a hand to block the light. "Turn that off." "No," Nora said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. The panic was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating efficiency that made her the best financial analyst in his entire organization. She was good at finding leaks. Right now, her boss was leaking. She moved the beam over his chest. His charcoal suit jacket was ruined, but the dark fabric had masked the true extent of the damage. Beneath the torn white shirt, his left side was soaked in a heavy, arterial red. "You're bleeding out," she stated, stating the facts the same way she would report a quarterly deficit. "It's a graze," he grunted, trying to bat her hand away. His movements were sluggish, uncoordinated. Nora ignored him. She set her phone on the floor, angling the beam upward so it illuminated his torso without blinding him. She reached out and grabbed the lapels of his suit jacket. Declan's hand shot out, his bloodied fingers wrapping around her wrist like a vice. Even half dead, his grip was like iron. His eyes snapped open, dark and dangerous. "Don't. Let go of me," Nora ordered, meeting his glare with a flat, unimpressed look of her own. "If you bleed to death in this elevator, I have to explain to the board why I'm sitting next to a corpse. And frankly, I don't have the energy for the paperwork. Let me see." For a long second, they just stared at each other. The predator and the accountant. Finally, the corner of his mouth twitched, a shadow of a grim smile. He released her wrist and let his head thump back against the glass. "You're a very pragmatic woman, Nora." "I'm underpaid," she corrected, pushing his jacket aside. She peeled the soaked fabric of his shirt back. The wound was ugly. It was a deep, ragged slice along his ribs, right below his armpit. Not a bullet hole. A blade. It was still seeping steadily, a dark, pulsing flow that pooled into the waistband of his trousers. Nora didn't hesitate. She took hold of the hem of her own white silk blouse, an expensive piece she had bought as a reward for surviving her first year at Gallagher Enterprises, and ripped it cleanly up the side seam. Declan watched her through half-lidded eyes. That looks like silk. It is. She folded the torn fabric into a thick square. Put it on my expense account. I'm putting your entire wardrobe on your expense account, she shot back. She leaned in, pressing the makeshift silk bandage directly against the gash on his ribs. Declan violently hissed, his entire body going rigid. His jaw clamped shut, the muscles jumping beneath his bruised skin as he fought to keep from screaming. His free hand instinctively flew up, gripping her hip to stop her from pushing harder, his fingers digging into her skin through her skirt. "Press harder," he ground out, his voice shaking with the effort of fighting the pain. Nora shifted her weight, leaning her body into her hands, applying as much pressure as she could. The proximity was startling. She was practically kneeling in his lap, her face mere inches from his chest. She could smell the sweat on his skin, the sharp tang of the copper, the lingering spice of his cologne. Beneath her hands, she felt the frantic, heavy beat of his heart. "Who did this to you?" she asked quietly, keeping her eyes fixed on her blood-soaked hands. "An acquisition that went hostile," he breathed, his head rolling to the side. He was staring at the side of her face. They didn't appreciate the terms of the buyout. "You run a logistics firm." "I run Chicago," he corrected softly. "Logistics is just the tax front." Nora let out a slow, shaking breath. "I balance the books for a logistics firm. Whatever you do outside of those books is not my business." "You really believe that?" His thumb moved against her hip, a slow, unconscious stroke that sent a startling jolt of heat through her veins. "You see the numbers, Nora. You see the money moving. You're too smart not to know." She pressed harder on his ribs. He winced, but didn't complain. "I know that my mother's nursing home costs $8,000 a month," Nora said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "I know that the health insurance you provide covers her heart medication. I know that as long as I only look at the numbers, I can sleep at night." Declan reached up. His hand was heavy, trembling slightly as he cupped the back of her neck. His thumb brushed against her hairline. It wasn't a threat. It was a terrifyingly intimate gesture of understanding. "You're in the dark with me now, Nora," he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers. "There's no going back to just the numbers after this." Time lost its meaning inside the metal box. According to the clock on Nora's phone, it had been 42 minutes since the elevator abruptly halted. In reality, it felt like they had been suspended in the concrete throat of the building for a lifetime. The air had grown thick and hot. The oxygen was depleting, making every breath feel like drawing cotton into her lungs. Nora sat on her heels, her hands aching and cramped from holding the bloody silk against Declan's ribs. The bleeding had slowed to a sluggish ooze, but he was terrifyingly pale. His skin was cold and clammy beneath her palms, his lips taking on a faint, bruised hue. He was awake, but barely. His eyes remained fixed on the ceiling hatch, tracking shadows only he could see. "Keep talking," he murmured, his voice barely a rasp. "I don't have anything left to say," Nora replied, her throat dry. She had spent the last 20 minutes reciting the financial projections for the upcoming fiscal quarter, just to keep him conscious. Tell me about the numbers," he insisted, his head resting heavily against the glass. "Tell me about the offshore accounts, the ones you think I don't know you found." Nora froze. Her hands tightened instinctively against his side. "I don't know what you're talking about." Declan let out a weak, breathy chuckle that ended in a cough. "Nora, please. You're a shark in a pencil skirt. You found the Cayman Shell companies your second month here. You just rerouted the interest to balance the domestic ledgers. It was brilliant. Saved me $3 million in taxes. She stared at him, stunned. You knew? Why didn't you fire me? Because you didn't steal it, he whispered, his eyes sliding closed. You just fixed it. You made order out of my chaos. I like order. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over them, broken only by the shallow rasp of his breathing. Nora shifted, her knees aching against the hard floor. She looked at the emergency phone panel, its wires dangling uselessly. Then she heard it. It wasn't the groan of settling metal. It was a distinct, metallic scrape. It echoed down the elevator shaft, vibrating through the ceiling directly above them. Clank. Nora stopped breathing. She looked up at the dimly lit escape hatch. Clank. Scrape. Someone was walking on the roof of the elevator cab. Declan's eyes snapped open. The exhaustion vanished, instantly replaced by the cold, lethal clarity she had seen in the lobby. He didn't speak. He reached down and gripped Nora's wrist, pulling her hands away from his wound. Get up, he mouthed silently. Nora scrambled backward, getting to her feet on shaking legs. She pressed herself against the side wall, as far away from the center of the cab as possible. Declan pushed himself up. It was a brutal, agonizing process. The veins in his neck bulged, his teeth bared in a silent snarl of pain as he forced his battered body off the floor. He leaned heavily against the handrail, his right hand slipping beneath the waistband of his trousers at the small of his back. When he brought his hand forward, he was holding a compact, matte black Sig Sauer. He hadn't pulled it in the lobby because of the cameras. But here, in the dark, there were no witnesses. Another heavy thud sounded from above. Dust and tiny flakes of rust drifted down from the edges of the ceiling hatch, dancing in the beam of Nora's flashlight, which was still resting on the floor. Turn the light off, Declan whispered. Nora dropped to a crouch, snatched her phone, and killed the flashlight. The cab plunged back into the dim, sickly amber glow of the emergency bulb. Declan moved to stand directly beneath the hatch. He raised the gun, his grip perfectly steady despite the blood loss. He aimed at the metal panel. When the hatch opens, Declan said, his voice a low, commanding thread in the dark. You get behind me. You do not look at them. You do not speak. If I fall, you take this gun, you point it at the opening, and you empty the magazine. Do you understand? I don't know how to shoot, Nora whispered, panic finally slicing through her icy facade. Point and pull, he ordered, not looking away from the ceiling. It's a machine, Nora. Just like your spreadsheets. Input and output. A sudden, violent screech of tearing metal echoed through the cab. The tip of a heavy crowbar wedged its way into the seam of the ceiling hatch. Nora pressed her hands over her mouth to muffle a scream. The crowbar wrenched downward. The metal hinges shrieked in protest. The hatch groaned, bending inward. Declan didn't flinch. He widened his stance, bracing his bleeding side against the handrail. He looked like a grim reaper, cast in shadow and blood, waiting to collect a debt. Get behind me, he commanded. Nora didn't hesitate. She threw herself across the small space, sliding behind his broad back. She gripped the back of his belt, anchoring herself to the only solid thing left in her world. His body was a shield of muscle and heat, standing between her and the violence tearing through the roof. The crowbar violently twisted again. The latch gave way with a sound like a gunshot. The hatch swung open, dropping into the cab and dangling by a single bent hinge. Total darkness stared down at them from the open shaft. The air pressure shifted, a rush of cold, dusty wind sweeping into the suffocating heat of the elevator. For 2 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Just the wind and the sound of Declan's steady, lethal breathing. Then, a beam of a heavy tactical flashlight cut through the darkness from above, sweeping down into the cab, searching for targets. Declan didn't wait to be found. He stepped directly into the beam of light, raised his weapon, and squeezed the trigger. Gunfire in a concrete tube doesn't just ring. It physically assaults you. The sound waves slammed against the steel walls, rebounding and crashing into Nora's skull with the force of a physical blow. She squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face into the damp, ruined fabric of Declan's jacket. He fired 3 times in rapid succession. Crack, crack, crack. The tactical flashlight beam above them vanished instantly, followed by the sickening sound of a heavy, dead weight collapsing against the metal roof of the elevator cab. Something wet and heavy dragged across the steel plates above. Then, absolute silence. The air in the cab instantly thickened, filling with the acrid, burning sulfur stench of cordite. It burned the back of Nora's throat, temporarily masking the smell of blood. Declan kept the gun raised. His chest heaved. He didn't lower the weapon, his eyes burning holes into the square of black space above them. He waited 10 seconds. 20. A minute. Nothing moved. Slowly, the adrenaline spike began to recede, and when it did, it took the last of Declan's strength with it. The Sig Sauer wavered in his grip. His arm dropped to his side, the gun feeling suddenly like it weighed 50 pounds. He took a ragged, shallow breath and leaned his entire weight back against the handrail. "They won't." "Send another one down," Declan rasped, his voice barely a whisper now. "Too narrow. Fatal funnel." Nora opened her eyes and stepped out from behind him. Her ears were ringing so loudly it sounded like a continuous, high-pitched dial tone. She looked up at the hatch. A slow, thick drop of blood fell from the jagged edge of the torn metal, splattering quietly onto the carpeted floor just inches from her shoe. She looked back at Declan. He was sliding down the glass again. This time he couldn't stop himself. He hit the floor hard, his head lolling to the side. The makeshift silk bandage had soaked completely through, turning a horrifying, saturated crimson. "Declan." She dropped to her knees beside him. He didn't open his eyes. His breathing was a terrible, wet sound, rattling deep in his chest. His fingers went slack, and the heavy black pistol slipped from his grip, thudding onto the carpet. Nora stared at the gun. It was a terrifying object. Cold, efficient, built entirely for ending human life. She had spent her entire existence avoiding violence, keeping her head down, staying invisible behind monitors and balance sheets. Point and pull. His words echoed in her ringing ears, input and output. She reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. The metal grip was warm from his skin. She didn't know how to check the safety or how many bullets were left in the magazine. She only knew she had to hold it. She sat back on her heels, resting her forearms on her knees, and aimed the barrel squarely at the open ceiling hatch. "I have it," she said to the empty air. Her voice shook, so she cleared her throat and tried again, forcing the corporate, detached tone she used during audit reviews. "I have the weapon. You need to stay awake." Declan let out a low groan. His eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes that were entirely unfocused. "Nora, I'm here. I'm holding your gun. It's ruining my manicure." A faint, ghostly smirk touched his pale lips. "Don't. Shoot your foot off. I'm aiming at the ceiling," she replied, not taking her eyes off the black square above. "If someone drops through that hole, I'm going to pull this trigger until it stops making noise. So you better hope your people get here first." "They're coming," he breathed. A violent shiver racked his broad frame. The blood loss was plunging his body into shock. His teeth clicked together. Nora looked down at him. He was freezing to death in a sweltering elevator. She placed the gun carefully on her lap, keeping her hand wrapped around the grip, and shifted closer to him. She didn't have a jacket to offer him. She didn't have a blanket. All she had was herself. She pulled her legs under her, closing the distance completely, and gently pulled his heavy head onto her lap. Declan stiffened in surprise, but he was too weak to resist. His cheek rested against the unruined side of her wool skirt. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, his body instinctively seeking the warmth radiating from her skin. "You're going to get blood all over your skirt," he mumbled, his breath ghosting against her thigh. "I've already mentally expensed it," Nora said, resting her free hand lightly on his dark hair. It was thick, damp with sweat. She stroked it once, a soothing, rhythmic motion that felt entirely natural despite the absurdity of the situation. Along with hazard pay and a significant bonus for the quarter. "Done," he whispered. He turned his face slightly, pressing his cold nose against her leg. "Whatever you want. I want you to stop bleeding on me. That's my primary demand. I'll do my best." His voice was fading, dipping into a dangerous, sluggish rhythm. "If I close my eyes—" "No." Nora gripped his hair, pulling just hard enough to make him wince. "You don't get to sleep. You owe me an explanation for the Cayman accounts. Walk me through the routing numbers. Now." He let out a weak laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. "You're a tyrant, Nora. I'm an accountant holding a loaded gun. Keep talking." Time dissolved into a static hum. Nora counted her own heartbeats. She counted the drops of blood falling from the ceiling. She counted the slow, shallow rises of Declan's chest against her legs. He was losing the fight to stay conscious. The banter had died away 20 minutes ago. Now he just breathed, shivering violently against her. She kept one hand buried in his hair, a desperate, grounding anchor for him, while her other hand maintained a death grip on the heavy pistol resting in her lap. She felt him slipping. His skin was the color of old parchment, cool and clammy to the touch. "Declan," she whispered, leaning over him. "Declan, wake up." He didn't move. Panic, cold and sharp, finally broke through her carefully constructed walls. She shook his shoulder. "Hey, boss, Mr. Gallagher, do not do this to me. Do not leave me in here with a dead body on the roof." Nothing. She dropped the gun. She grabbed his face with both hands, her thumbs pressing hard into his cheekbones. "Declan!" A sudden, violent screech of metal echoed from below them. Nora flinched, snapping her head toward the closed elevator doors. The sound wasn't coming from the shaft above. It was coming from the floor they were stuck on. Floor 26. Heavy, frantic thuds pounded against the exterior doors. "Boss! Declan, you in there?" A muffled voice shouted through the thick steel. Nora recognized the rough, Southside accent instantly. Garrett, Declan's head of security. The man who technically didn't exist on any payroll ledger she had ever audited. "We're here!" Nora screamed, her voice cracking. "He's hurt! We need a medic!" "Stand back from the doors!" Garrett yelled. Nora grabbed the gun by the barrel, shoved it into her purse, and grabbed Declan by the shoulders. She couldn't drag him, he was too heavy, but she managed to shift her own body, pulling his head and torso away from the center seam of the doors. A heavy, motorized grinding sound began. The steel doors shuddered violently. Someone was using a hydraulic spreader on the outside. The metal groaned, protesting the immense pressure, and then, with a deafening crack, the doors parted an inch. Bright, blinding white light pierced the gloom of the cab. Nora threw a hand up over her eyes. The gap widened to a foot, then 2 feet. The jaws of life retracted, and 2 men in dark suits stepped into the breach, violently prying the inner doors apart manually. Garrett stepped into the elevator. He was a massive wall of muscle, holding a submachine gun lowered to his side. The moment his eyes landed on Declan, unmoving in a pool of his own blood, the color drained from his weathered face. "Jesus Christ!" Garrett swore, dropping his weapon to its sling and rushing forward. "Medic, get the bag in here now!" A man with a trauma kit scrambled through the opening. Suddenly, the confined space was full of movement, shouting and blinding flashlights. They swarmed Declan. Hands pulled him away from Nora. She was shoved backward, hitting the mirrored wall. "Get a pressure dressing on that side," the medic barked, ripping Declan's ruined shirt entirely open. "He's severely hypertensive. I need a line in his arm, right now." Nora stood, backed against the glass, her hands covered in dried blood, her ruined skirt clinging to her legs. She watched them work on him with ruthless, practiced efficiency. The corporate illusion was entirely shattered. This wasn't a logistics firm handling an emergency. This was a cartel saving their king. "Mom, you need to step out." A hand gripped her elbow. Nora yanked her arm away. "Don't touch me." Garrett looked up from where he was kneeling beside Declan. He looked at Nora, really looked at her. He saw the blood soaking her clothes, the torn silk shirt used as a bandage, and the cold, unyielding fire in her eyes. The dismissal died on his tongue. "Let her be," Garrett snapped at his man. He looked back down. Boss, can you hear me?" The medic squeezed a bag of saline directly into an IV line he had just jammed into Declan's vein. The rush of fluids provoked a reaction. Declan let out a sharp, ragged gasp. His eyes flew open. They were wild, unseeing for a fraction of a second before they locked onto the bright lights of the lobby outside. "We got you, boss," Garrett said softly. "You're safe. We're moving you." Declan ignored him. His head snapped around, his dark eyes sweeping the crowded elevator cab until they found her. Nora was standing in the shadows, looking small but completely unbroken. "Nora!" he rasped, his voice raw. He tried to push the medic away, struggling to sit up. "Where is she?" "I'm right here," Nora said. She stepped forward into the light. Declan stared at her. He took in the blood on her hands, the ruined state of her clothes, the purse clutched tightly to her chest that he knew held his gun. The tension drained out of his shoulders. He fell back onto the carpet, letting the medic resume packing the wound. "Garrett," Declan said, his voice regaining a fraction of its usual cold authority. "Yeah, boss." "Ms. Nora gets a security detail. 2 men. 24 hours. She doesn't go anywhere without them." "Done. And Garrett?" Declan's eyes drifted back to Nora, holding her gaze with a burning, heavy intensity that made her breath catch all over again. "Yeah?" No one asks her about the gun in her bag. Garrett blinked, glancing at Nora's purse, then nodded once. "Understood." They loaded him onto a collapsible stretcher. As they lifted him and carried him out of the ruined metal box, Nora followed. She stepped out of the elevator and into the harsh fluorescent light of the 26th floor. The world had expanded again. But it felt entirely different. She looked at her blood-stained hands. She wasn't just an analyst anymore. She had crossed a line in the dark, and looking at Declan Gallagher being wheeled down the corridor, she knew he was never going to let her cross back. Cold water hammered against the porcelain basin, swirling into a diluted, rusty pink before vanishing down the drain. Nora scrubbed her hands with cheap, industrial soap from the 26th floor employee restroom dispenser. She scrubbed until her knuckles were raw and stinging, but the phantom smell of copper and bergamot clung to her skin. She stared at her reflection in the mirror above the sink. Her hair was a mess of tangled dark curls. A smudge of soot and grease stained her left cheek. Her expensive white silk blouse, the one she had saved for 3 months to buy, was gone, replaced by an oversized heavy fleece jacket someone from the security team had thrown over her shoulders. She looked like a survivor pulled from a shipwreck. In a way, she was. "Ma'am?" A rough voice called from the hallway. Nora grabbed a rough paper towel, dried her hands, and walked out. A man built like a commercial refrigerator stood in the corridor. He wore a sharp suit that barely concealed the bulky outline of a shoulder holster. Garrett had called him Miller. He was one of the 2 shadows assigned to her for the foreseeable future. Garrett sent a car around to the private garage, Miller said, his tone perfectly polite but devoid of any actual warmth. "We're taking you home." "I have files on my desk," Nora replied, her voice sounding thin and hollow in the vast, empty corridor. "I need my laptop." Miller shook his head. "Your belongings have already been secured and placed in the vehicle. The boss was clear. You go home, you lock the door. You don't come back to the building until he says so." Nora wanted to argue. She wanted to point out that it was Tuesday night and the quarterly tax projections were due on Friday. But the image of Declan Gallagher lying in a pool of his own blood flashed behind her eyes, shutting down her corporate autopilot. She simply nodded, pulled the oversized jacket tighter around herself, and followed Miller to a different, functioning elevator. Her apartment in Logan Square was small, practical, and usually a sanctuary. Tonight it felt like a fishbowl. Miller and his silent partner, Finn, did a sweep of the rooms before allowing her inside. They checked the window locks, the fire escape, and the closets with a terrifying, practiced efficiency. "We'll be in the hall," Miller told her, pausing at the front door. "Don't open it for anyone. If you need food, slide a list under the door. We handle it." The deadbolt clicked shut, leaving Nora standing alone in her narrow kitchen. She walked into the bathroom, stripped off her ruined, blood-soaked wool skirt, and threw it directly into the trash can. She stood under a scalding shower for 40 minutes, watching the last physical evidence of the night swirl away. But the adrenaline crash had finally arrived, leaving her limbs feeling like lead and her chest tight with a delayed, suffocating panic. She had held a gun. She had waited for a man to drop through a ceiling hatch so she could shoot him. Wrapping a towel around herself, Nora walked into the living room and opened her laptop. She didn't check the news. A broken elevator and a dead body in a corporate shaft wouldn't make the morning papers. Declan's people would scrub the scene clean before the sun came up. Instead, she opened her encrypted work portal. He had told her to look at the offshore accounts, the Caymans. She navigated through the labyrinth of Gallagher Enterprises' subsidiary holdings. She had always known the numbers didn't perfectly align, but she had treated it as a puzzle to be solved, a messy ledger to balance. Now, with the veil ripped away, she looked at the routing numbers and saw them for what they were. Blood money, protection rackets, bribes. She stared at the glowing screen until her eyes burned. $3 million. It was exactly the amount he had mentioned in the elevator. He knew she had found it. He had watched her quietly fix his mistakes for over a year, saying absolutely nothing. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, shattering the quiet. The caller ID read St. Jude's Assisted Living. Nora snatched it up, her heart leaping into her throat. "Hello? Nora, dear. It's Nancy from the night desk." The nurse's warm voice floated through the speaker. "I'm so sorry to call this late. Your mother just had a bit of a restless night, and she was asking for you. I told her you were working hard." Nora closed her eyes, letting out a long, shaky breath. "Is she okay? Is her heart rate stable?" "She's perfectly fine. Vitals are strong. I just wanted to update you. And, well, I wanted to thank you. The administration office told us your employer upgraded her suite this evening. The new room has a lovely view of the gardens. It really calmed her down." Nora's grip on the phone tightened until her knuckles turned white. "My employer?" "Yes, Gallagher Enterprises," Nancy said brightly. "A representative called about an hour ago. Fully covered the transition and prepaid the private nursing fees for the next year. You must be doing a wonderful job over there, Nora." "Yeah," Nora whispered, staring at the encrypted ledgers on her laptop screen. The numbers blurred. "I'm doing a wonderful job. Thank you, Nancy. Tell my mum I love her." She hung up and dropped the phone onto the couch. Declan was unconscious, bleeding out on a hospital bed somewhere, and his machine was still working. He was building a wall of money and protection around her, trapping her in his world just as effectively as the broken elevator had trapped her in the dark. Paperwork was the only thing holding Nora's sanity together. For 3 days, she sat in her apartment under the watchful, silent guard of Miller and Finn, crunching numbers. She didn't sleep. She drank awful black coffee and audited every single ghost account Declan had hidden within the logistics firm. She found the bribes to the Port Authority. She found the shell companies used to launder cash from the South Side distribution rings. By Thursday morning, she had mapped out the entire financial nervous system of Chicago's most dangerous syndicate. At noon, heavy knocks sounded at her door. "We're moving," Miller said the moment she opened it. He didn't offer an explanation. Nora didn't ask for one. She packed her laptop, shoved the printed ledgers into her leather tote, and followed him out. The black SUV didn't take her back to the Gallagher Enterprises building. Instead, they drove out to the Gold Coast, pulling into the subterranean garage of a luxury high-rise. Miller escorted her up a private elevator that didn't stop until it hit the penthouse. The doors slid open to reveal a massive, sunlit living space. It was minimalist, expensive, and cold. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, panoramic view of Lake Michigan, but the glass was thick and heavily tinted, bulletproof. Garrett was standing by a massive marble kitchen island, typing on a tablet. He looked up, giving Nora a tight nod. "He's in the office. Down the hall, last door on the right." Nora gripped her tote bag and walked down the wide corridor. The floors were polished hardwood that muffled her footsteps. She stopped outside the heavy oak door, took a single grounding breath, and pushed it open. Declan was standing by the window. He looked terrible. He was dressed in dark sweatpants and a loose black t-shirt, completely stripping away the armor of his bespoke suits. He was pale, moving with a stiff, careful rigidity that betrayed the heavy bandages wrapped tightly around his ribs. A cane leaned against the glass near his hip. He turned slowly as she entered. The bruising on his face had settled into a harsh, ugly yellow and purple, but his dark eyes were as sharp and unyielding as ever. "You look tired, Nora," he said. His voice was a low gravel, rougher than usual. "I've been balancing the books for a cartel," Nora replied, her voice flat. She walked over to his massive mahogany desk, opened her tote, and dumped a 3-inch stack of printed spreadsheets onto the polished surface. "It's very tedious work." Declan stared at the papers, then looked back at her. A faint, genuine smile pulled at the corner of his mouth, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I see you found the Cayman files." "I found everything." Nora crossed her arms over her chest. She wasn't backing down. Not today. "I found the Port Authority payouts. I found the dummy construction firms. I know exactly how much blood is moving through this company, Declan." He didn't flinch at the use of his first name. He took a slow, measured step toward her, favoring his left side. "And what are you going to do with that information?" "Nothing," she said truthfully. "Because if I go to the feds, your people will kill me. And if I quit, I lose the health insurance keeping my mother alive, which you made very clear when you moved her into a luxury suite while you were bleeding out on a stretcher." Declan stopped on the other side of the desk. He leaned his palms flat against the wood, bracing his weight. "That wasn't a threat, Nora. That was a thank you." "It was a leash," she shot back. "You bought my silence." "I don't need to buy your silence. You proved your loyalty in the dark." His voice dropped, losing the corporate detachment, settling into that dangerous, intimate space they had occupied in the elevator. "You had my gun. You had a clear shot at my back. You could have ended it all right there and told Garrett the man in the ceiling did it. But you didn't. You put yourself between me and the door." Nora felt a hot flush of anger and something entirely more complicated rise in her chest. "I didn't save you because I'm loyal to your syndicate. I saved you because I'm not a murderer." "You're not," he agreed softly. But you're not just an accountant anymore, either." He walked around the desk. Nora instinctively took a half-step back, but he didn't crowd her. He stopped a foot away, close enough that she could smell the clean soap on his skin, devoid of the copper scent that had haunted her for 3 days. "You're in," Declan said, his gaze locking onto hers. "You know the architecture of my life now. I need someone who can see the numbers and understand the violence behind them without breaking. I need you to run the financial side of this family." "I don't want to be in a family," she whispered. "You don't have a choice. The man who dropped that elevator knows you were with me. To my enemies, you belong to me." Nora's breath caught. "Belong to me." The words were possessive, heavy, and terrifyingly real. Declan raised his left hand. He winced slightly, the movement pulling at his stitched ribs, but he didn't stop. He reached out, his knuckles still raw and scabbing, and gently hooked a finger under her chin. He tilted her face up, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. "I protect what is mine," he murmured, his thumb brushing against her jawline, exactly where he had felt her pulse in the dark. "You balance my books, you keep my money clean, and in return, no one in this city will ever touch you. Not the feds, not the rival crews, no one. Do we have a deal, Nora?" She looked at the bruised, dangerous man, offering her a crown forged in blood. She thought of her mother, safe in a garden suite. She thought of the cold, heavy weight of the gun in her lap. Nora swallowed hard, leaned slightly into his touch, and nodded. "We have a deal." Rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the executive suite, fracturing the city lights into a smear of bruised purple and harsh yellow. 6 months had passed since the elevator dropped. 6 months since Nora stopped being a civilian and started running the financial architecture of the Gallagher family. She sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of black slate. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, the rhythmic clatter the only sound in the cavernous office. On her left monitor, a routing sequence completed. On her right, an offshore account belonging to a man named Arthur Sullivan was quietly, systematically zeroed out. Sullivan had tried to muscle in on the Southside distribution lines. He had bribed a judge and sent 2 enforcers to intimidate one of Garrett's lieutenants. Old cartel tactics. Loud, messy. Nora didn't use enforcers. She used algorithms. She had spent 3 weeks tracing Sullivan's laundered money through a labyrinth of shell companies in Cyprus, finding the exact pressure points, holding his empire together. Tonight, she pressed them. She triggered a series of margin calls on his over-leveraged properties, froze his liquid assets through a ghost injunction, and bled his entire operation dry without firing a single bullet. The heavy oak doors to her office swung open. Declan walked in. The cane was gone. The brutal bruising that had painted his face in the elevator was a distant memory. He wore a sharply tailored navy suit, moving with a silent, predatory grace that commanded the oxygen in the room. He didn't look like a man who had nearly bled to death on a carpet. He looked like the king of Chicago. Garrett trailed a few steps behind him, holding a burner phone. "Sullivan is calling again, boss. That's the 4th time in 10 minutes. He's panicking." "Let it ring," Declan said, not taking his eyes off Nora. He crossed the room, stopping at the edge of her desk. "Is it done?" Nora hit the final keystroke. The spreadsheet turned grey, locked and encrypted. "Arthur Sullivan is officially bankrupt. His supply chain is completely frozen, and his contractors won't receive their payroll tomorrow morning. By noon, his own people will turn on him." Garrett let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Remind me to never piss you off, Ms. Nora." "You're dismissed, Garrett," Declan said quietly. The big security chief nodded, backing out of the room and pulling the heavy doors shut behind him. The click of the latch echoed like a vault ceiling shut. Nora leaned back in her ergonomic chair, rubbing the bridge of her nose. The adrenaline of the financial kill was already fading, leaving a cold, hollow exhaustion in its wake. She had ruined a man tonight. 6 months ago, the thought would have made her physically sick. Now she just calculated the tax implications of absorbing his seized assets. She was changing, hardening into something sharp and unforgiving. Declan walked around the desk. Nora's breath hitched, a purely involuntary betrayal of her pulse. It happened every time he breached her personal space. They didn't talk about what happened in the elevator. They didn't have to. The memory of his blood on her hands and his head in her lap hung between them like a physical entity, dictating every interaction, every shared silence. He stopped beside her chair. He didn't say a word. He reached down, gripped the armrests, and spun her chair 90 degrees so she was facing him. Nora looked up. He was staring down at her with an intensity that made the air in the room feel heavy and charged. "You look exhausted," Declan murmured. "Dismantling a criminal syndicate takes a lot of mental energy," Nora replied, keeping her voice perfectly even. "You usually just shoot them. My way requires spreadsheets." A slow, dark smile curved his lips. "Your way is infinitely more cruel. I like it." He stepped closer, invading the space between her knees. The sharp, familiar scent of bergamot and expensive wool washed over her, grounding her instantly. He reached down and rested his hands on the arms of her chair, effectively caging her in. It was a deliberate echo of the elevator, the physical trap. Nora didn't shrink back this time. She held his gaze, her chin tilted up in a silent challenge. "Am I getting a bonus for this, Mr. Gallagher? I bought you a penthouse, Nora. I fund your mother's private wing. I gave you the keys to my entire kingdom." His voice dropped to a rough, gravelly whisper. "What else could you possibly want? I want you to stop looming over me like you're about to order a hit." Declan let out a soft huff of breath. He shifted his weight, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. The predatory edge in his eyes softened into something raw and terrifyingly possessive. He lifted his right hand. The knuckles were fully healed, bearing only faint, silver scars. He reached toward her face. Nora's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't move. She let him brush his knuckles against her cheek, the touch shockingly gentle against the cold, ruthless backdrop of their world. He caught a dark, tangled curl that had slipped loose from her clip. He slowly tucked it behind her ear. His fingers lingered on the side of her neck, his thumb pressing lightly over her pulse point. It was racing. He felt it, and a satisfied gleam flickered in his dark eyes. "You're not afraid of me anymore," Declan stated. It wasn't a question. "No," Nora whispered, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. "I'm not." "Good." He moved his hand to the back of her neck, his grip firm and anchoring. "Because you're mine now. You belong to the dark, and you belong to me." There is no exit strategy, Nora. She looked at the man who had dragged her into the underworld, the man who killed to protect her and who trusted her with the very lifeblood of his empire. She felt the heavy, inescapable weight of his touch and the dangerous thrill it sent straight to her core. She had traded her soul for security, but what she got was him. "I balance the ledgers, Declan," Nora said, her voice steady and quiet as she reached up, her hand wrapping over his. "I don't look for exits." He pulled her out of the chair and pulled her against his chest, sealing the contract in the shadows of the Chicago skyline. Did Nora make the right choice by stepping fully into Declan's dangerous world, or is she playing a game she can't win? If this intense, high-stakes mafia romance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Share this video with a fellow dark romance fan and drop a comment below. Would you have taken Declan's deal or walked away? Your support fuels these stories, so stay tuned for the next chapter.